You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
No guns, no wars, no hateful noise. Just a victory dance, I'll never taste defeat. Where there's nothing done or said that can't be forgiven. Every step you take is on sacred ground. Walk away from death to the land of the...
Well, happy Friday evening to everybody. It's the end of the week, and today I was sitting here trying to ponder what I wanted to do for tonight's show. Did I want to continue on with my series on Jesus and Lucifer and that comparison? And I found that there is so much information there. I didn't want to bog down without looking into a couple of other aspects of that first, because there are rabbit trails off of that. So I'm going to jump back into that series next week, but I want to introduce a little something different tonight. And this is a topic I've wanted to talk about for a long time, so we'll maybe do a little jumping around. We'll have some of the biblical mystery episodes and then some of these other historical episodes, and maybe start doing a little geek show stuff in the middle here. On Star Trek and Star Wars and science fiction and fantasy and things like that. I tend to be, I love having a good time, but I tend to be fairly serious when it comes to talking, and maybe I get too serious for some people, but I think you're enjoying it, and I hope you are from what I read and the comments I'm getting and the emails and messages I get. And by the way, in case you don't know, this is Scotty Roberts, and you're listening to the Intrepid radio program here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And that's ODYSY1.com if you want to go hear just the audio that broadcasts out to their national network. Or you can come over to my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts, Mr. spelled all out, and Scotty with a Y. So come on over. And you can watch the what's with all my uhs today? I think I'm a little off kilter, probably because it's the end of the week. You think I'd be really happy and dancing a jig for joy and stuff like that, but I think it's been a long week, and my brain's a little tired. So pardon my uhs, like I just did again. It's a manner of speak that you try to eradicate when you do radio or when you're public speaking, but it comes out from time to time. So if I have a long pause, you'll know I consciously caught the coming out of my head. So I wanted to do this series. It's kind of based on a book that is, of course, not sitting where I thought I had left it here on my desk. But, and it's a topic that I became very interested in a long time ago, and it is the book by D. Brown called Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. If any of you have read that book, you'll know how heart-wrenching the book can be, but at the same time, what an important book it is. And if I could, I would sit and just read his book online, but I want to make some commentary. I'm going to reference some things I've pulled out of his book and talk about this a little bit. If you don't know what Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee is all about, it is about the conquest of the American West and what I would call, literally, I don't care where you stand politically, what I would call the subjugation of the Native American peoples. And we used to call them American Indians and Native Americans, the Indians, of course, which was a misnomer that was placed on them way back when they were discovered as a people here on this continent. Because, of course, Columbus and others thought they were in the West Indies, or in the Indies, and that's where the name came from. And so I wanted to talk about this because I think it's an important topic. It's an important topic not for... There are some people who are activists that would take up the mantle of the cause of the Native American peoples. I am not an activist. I am an historian, though, and I think while there are important activism aspects to the Native American movement that's out there and Native American peoples, I think there is also an importance to knowing the history for everyone. And I'm going to say right up front, I have never been one who believes, while I support the Native American movement and Native Americans as a people, I've never been one that said I'm going to give my house and my property back to the local tribe that used to live here. We are in different times now. And if you are Native American and you hear this and this makes you bristle, don't shut this off. Hear me out. Express your opinion as well. You can come into the chat room over on the YouTube channel, which is live, and express yourself there. You can message me. You can call me on the phone. I have no problem with people knowing my phone number. I've had this phone, well, not this phone, not the physical phone, but I've had this phone number for the last 12 years, I think. When I was the editor-in-chief at Taps Para magazine, the Ghost Hunters official magazine, I had this phone, and I gave this number out to all our subscribers. If you had questions, call me. So my phone number's always been out there, and I got to tell you, I've rarely gotten crank calls. I mostly get advertising calls. But, so you can find my phone number. It's on my website, which the website is right down below here. If you look at that scrolling bar, there it is right there, scottallenroberts.com. You can find my phone number there. You can find it everywhere. Give me a call if you want to talk about stuff. Send me an email. Make some comments in the live chat room on our simulcast YouTube stream. And I'd love to hear your points of view. But what I was going to say was this, is that we live in a different era now. The atrocities that took place, and yeah, I say atrocities, the tragedy of the subjugation, of the conquering, of the diminishment, for lack of better words off the top of my head, of the Native American peoples, is a travesty in history. What we did as a nation to them was abhorrent, I believe. There are some who will say, well, you know, we were a new nation and we were expanding and, you know, they were a conquered people. I've heard that. And that's the history of the human race. Yeah, that's very true. But there are times where you hope we have evolved to a point where we don't go in and kill people in their villages, innocents, families and children, along with fighters, in order to subjugate their people. We just don't do that anymore, and we shouldn't do that. That is a matter of morality and conscience, I believe. Our conscience as a nation was set aside during the expansion into the American West. And there are those who would say we owe the Native American peoples. Well, perhaps corporately there might be something to that. The corporation of the United States, if you will. I'm not going to get into that so much. But there could be an argument for that. And I would love to have a conversation with somebody as a guest on this show and talk about that very thing. But as I have said many times, I was not alive back then. I was not part of the subjugation and the destruction of the Native American culture. Nor is there anyone living today who was there. So when that happened, none of us alive today were there. Now you might say that there are those living today that are the product of what happened 100 to 150 years ago and a little bit earlier. As white Europeans moved into the United States and expanded west on this continent, many of us are their ancestors. And all of the Native American peoples alive today are products and ancestors of those who were subjugated. I get that, and I understand that. At the same time, there's not much we can do to change what happened over a century ago. And so we have to live with what is in the here and the now. I do believe the United States needs to maintain its treaty rights that they made. In many of the treaties that were written with the tribes, there was the phrase in perpetuity that was added to these treaties, contracts made between the United States government and Native American tribes. And in perpetuity meant just that, forever, meaning this shall be this way forever. But what we have found through the last century is whenever there was a reason for the United States government to want the land that they pushed the tribes onto, they found ways to rescind the treaties or get around the treaties. Nowadays, I know mostly since the 60s and the 70s, you've started to see the Native American tribes fight legally for the upholding of these contracts. And that's a good thing. There was something I read in D. Brown's book, and a piece of history I know about was in the 70s. There were tribal peoples from the plains that were pushed into the Bosque Redondo down in New Mexico. And the Bosque Redondo was this dry piece of desert land that the tribes from the Central American plains were pushed down into. That was to be their reservation. Completely different than their homeland, completely different than what they were used to. But they were pushed into this dust bowl, and they had a treaty that was written in perpetuity, that this would be theirs. So it became not just a dust bowl, it became their dust bowl. And in the 70s, they discovered, now I'm doing this off the top of my head, so I may have to amend some of my facts in this as I go and talk about this more in future shows, but they discovered uranium deposits on the Bosque Redondo. And all of a sudden, the U.S. government, who pushed them onto this piece of shit land because they had no use for it, and let's put the tribe there, suddenly wanted to rescind the treaty rights. And if I am not mistaken, I've got to check on my legal facts on this. I believe that is still in 2019 in contestation in court. I don't believe that was ever settled. But I might be wrong on that. That was as of my last reading. Like I say, I'm pulling some of this off the top of my head, so it's been a while. But this is the kind of thing that the Native American tribes have faced all the way along. Now, I understand that there were people in the 18th and the 19th century who were white settlers who hated the Native American peoples, and they saw them as savages. They saw them as people that would kill them if they had the opportunity. And they may have been right to a certain degree, only from the standpoint that they were invading on their land. We, as white settlers, were invading on their land. And as hostilities kept mounting over the decades, there were atrocities committed on both sides. And it created animosity. It created the Indian Wars, as we called them. Came out. There was an Indian War here. There was the Dakota Wars were here in Minnesota. And you've heard me talk about the Renaissance Festival before. And I think I was talking with Audrey, and I was talking about the town where the Renaissance Festival is located. It's down in Shakopee, Minnesota, and right next door to Chaska, Minnesota. Now, something that people don't realize nowadays, you go driving through that part of it's southwest of the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, half an hour out of town, and you're out in the country, and you're in these small towns. And what people don't realize nowadays is all those towns were named after Native American chiefs, and some of them warriors in the Dakota Wars. Towns like Shakopee, towns like Chaska, Red Wing, and there's several others that are around that area, are all named after the personages that were in Minnesota from the Native American tribes that represented the either the faction that was fighting against the American military, or great personages within the tribes down there. And so you will see a lot of the. We've got Lake Nokomis in Minneapolis. They just renamed a lake in the cities. In Minneapolis and South Minneapolis, we have an area called Uptown. I used to have a studio there. Eclectic, upbeat part of town, but it's on the Lake District. There's these small lakes that are all. There's a chain of 3 or 4 of them that are all linked inside the city, the inner city. And we call it the Lake District. And, of course, there's a lot of big houses over there and so on. And one of the lakes I grew up was knowing Lake Calhoun. And they just voted to rename that lake this year back to its original Native American name. And I can't even say it. I don't even know what it is. Minnewaska or something like that. I'd have to look it up. As a matter of fact, while I'm sitting here on my computer, I will look. Hold on. I got something going on here. Something playing. Sorry about that, folks. If I go over to my browser and I look up Lake Calhoun renamed, I'll give you the name. Well, now I don't know where it's going. There we go. It's Lake Calhoun became Bde-Makaska. BDE space MAKA space SKA. Bde-Makaska. I don't even know if that's the right way to pronounce it. And there were a lot of people that had a problem with that. I had a problem with that. I thought, we grew up and everybody knows this is Lake Calhoun. I don't know what I got on my face. I just noticed that. For those of you watching, I had something black all over my face. Don't know if I just did that or if it's been there for a while. I had a problem with it only because I was like, come on. I understand that was the original Native American name, but attached to that was the politics of the guy it was named after. Calhoun was either a slaveholder or something like that back in the day. I don't even know all the facts about that. Excuse me, I'd have to look into that to give you more accurate facts about it. But that is land that was Indian land. And so there is activism today. There is activism based on politics today. One thing that I saw was with the advent of the Native American gaming, the casinos and the gambling on the reservations. They have a right to do that. They are not independent of the United States, but they have their own sovereignty to a certain extent there. Even though they fall under the laws of the federal and state governments, they are sovereign nations. They have the right to do that there, where we outlawed it in, say, the state of Minnesota. Gambling was outlawed. Casinos were outlawed until the Native Americans came along and said, hey, we can do this. And they were making a killing. And my reaction at the time, there were people that were against it. We need to shut that down. I said, nah, I don't care. I said, I'm all for it. You know why? I said, this is something where the Native Americans can say, we're doing something proactive for our communities, utilizing gambling and casinos, and you know what? We're doing well at it, and we can do that. And I saw that as something very positive. Even though gambling, you look at it as not a big positive, the casinos themselves have been very positive things for the reservations here. Some of those who live in the Twin Cities up here in Minneapolis and St. Paul, you don't realize sometimes you're driving through reservations. There's a little town to the west of us, Prior Lake. There's a Native American reservation there, and you can go to the big gambling casino there, but you're on reservation land there. And it's right in it feels like it's just right part of the city, suburb of the city. And so I'm like, more power to them. And then the state wanted to start passing laws to change the law about gambling so the state of Minnesota and Wisconsin and others could open up their own casinos and counter, because they saw all this income flowing into the reservations. And before that, they were trying to outlaw the reservations, legislate them out of existence. They couldn't do it. And that's where I was like, more power to you guys. And you know what? I have here in front of me, because we've got a few minutes left in this. We got about 5 or 6 minutes left in this segment. This is D. Brown's book, and I wanted to give you a taste for this. One of my favorite periods of history is the Lewis and Clark expeditions, events out of history, where Lewis and Clark were sent out by President Jefferson to find what they hoped was the passage to the Pacific, the Northwest Passage, or the passage through the continental America to the Pacific coast. And it's an amazing story. If you want to read a good book, pick up Stephen Ambrose' Undaunted Courage. Or is it Courage Undaunted? I think it's Undaunted Courage, about the Lewis and Clark expedition. Phenomenal book. And if you don't read, if you don't like to read, don't have time to read, get the audio tape of that. I think we took a family trip once a long time ago, and I played the tapes, it was, in the car back then, and listened to that book. So, in Bury My Heart and Wounded Knee, it's interesting that in the beginning, he starts with this quote. This is from Tecumseh of the Shawnee. Tecumseh was relatively a contemporary of Daniel Boone. I remember the first time I heard the name Tecumseh. He was an Indian chief in the television show that was spawned by the Disney Davy Crockett movies with Fess Parker. Fess Parker played Daniel Boone in the buckskins and the fringes and the coonskin cap. Let's see. And that was in the 60s that came out. And Tecumseh was somebody that he was always having problems with, the Native Americans. And there's this quote from Tecumseh in this book. Tecumseh, 200 years ago, almost 250 years ago, said, "Where today are the Pequot? Where are the Narragansett, the Mohican, the Pokanoket, and many other powerful tribes of our people? They vanished before the avarice and the oppression of the white man, as snow before a summer sun. We will let ourselves be destroyed in our turn without a struggle, give up our homes." He said, "Will we let ourselves be destroyed in our turn without a struggle, give up our homes, our country bequeathed to us by the Great Spirit, the graves of our dead, and everything that is dear and sacred to us? I know you will cry with me, never, never." That was Tecumseh of the Shawnees, and this is how this book opens up in chapter 1. But in his introduction, D. Brown starts talking about Lewis and Clark and how that expedition began a lot of what would be the conquest of the American West. And we'll get into that when we come back, because I'm right down on the break. And so 2 minutes, folks. I'll be right back. We'll pick this up where we left off. And we'll hopefully see some of your comments in the live chat. And I'll talk to you when I get back. Wow, I can't even do a proper out right now. My brain is muddled. So, folks, sit tight. I'll be right back.
Plenty to eat. No guns, no wars, no hatefulness. Just a victory dance, I'll never taste defeat. Where there's nothing done or said that can't be forgiven. Every step you take is on sacred ground. Walk away from death to the land of the living, where all the lost tribes are finally found. I said, where are you going? To a ghost dance in the snow. I am a mighty warrior, and I'm finally coming home. I said, where are you going? To a ghost dance in the snow. I am a mighty warrior, yes, I'm finally coming home. Yes, I'm finally coming home.
Hey folks, thanks for coming back. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And that's ODYSY1.com. You can go over there and find a list of places where you can hear this on terrestrial stations, as well as iHeartRadio and other places. Or you can just listen to the audio if you don't have the ability to watch the video. You can also come and see the video simulcast over on my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts, and Mr. all spelled out. And go visit my website. You can see down below here the scrolling bar at the bottom if you're watching the video. My website, scottallenroberts.com. And you can see all about my stuff, what I do for a living other than this radio show. You see my pregnant pause there. And when you come over to the YouTube channel, like it, please. Subscribe to it. Help build me up. I would love to monetize my channel along with the show, and I can only do that after I've reached 1,000 subscribers. And I've gained 700 of you in the last 6 months, so let's see if you can help push us up over 1,000. I'd love to see that happen. And then like the videos if you're watching. Join in the live chat room. If you don't want to chat, just come on over and watch the videos. There, enough of that. Now, we left off, I was starting to talk about Lewis and Clark and the Lewis and Clark expedition to the Pacific coast. And it was in the 19th century. It was 1805, I believe, is when Lewis and Clark started out. And you know, I have something here that this is a little unorthodox. I'm going to do this during the live broadcast. Those of you on the radio, I'm stepping away from my mic for a minute. I want to show you something that I've got here, and those of you watching on the video, you can see this as well. But I'm sorry for those of you listening on the radio that you aren't going to be able to see this. So you can come over to the YouTube channel, and you'll be able to see this. This is something I didn't plan ahead of time, and that's why it's not sitting here on my desk where I can show you. But I said I was kind of a Lewis and Clark. I wouldn't call myself an aficionado, but I had studied and read about Lewis and Clark, and it's one of my favorite events in history, as I mentioned in the first segment. And a few years back, I had met another guy on the Living History Trail, where we used to do the 42nd Royal Highlanders, the Highland Scots fighting in the French and Indian War in the 1750s in North America. And we would set up an encampment, had a bunch of guys that were in uniform and all the things that we did, muskets and swords and redcoats and kilts and all of that. Well, this guy was doing a Lewis and Clark presentation. And I want to show you these. He had, out of his own pocket, he made these action figures which I have never taken out of the box, despite the pleading of my now 18-year-old son and my 10-year-old son to take these things apart. If you can look on the video, if you're watching, he had these action figures made up because he did a history in costume, and he built a replica of the mast of the bateau and stuff like that they used to go down the rivers. And so he did these action figures, and I want you to see this. If I were to open this up, you see this is Meriwether Lewis, and you can see the action figure there and the detail he's put into it. You can see over on this side, he's got the haversack. He's actually got a diary or a journal down here, you see in the leather, and it's filled with documents, miniatures of documents. Over on this side, if I hold this up a little differently and try to not have the light reflect on it, you can see he's got the muskets and the swords and the compasses, the knives, the daggers, and all of that. So this is Meriwether Lewis of the Lewis and Clark team, if you're watching on the video. And so I guess this is one of the perks of being able to come over and see the video. And this is the box that has in it Captain William Clark. And you can see there's Captain Clark and all the artwork that was done to create the faces and so on are based on paintings of these guys. And there you see he's got kind of the same thing, his haversack, his compass, his journal, his uniform, his clothes. And over on this side, he's got his. And they're slightly different than Lewis's. They're not just all... There's a telescope in there, a powder horn, a couple of muskets, a sextant down at the bottom. And so this was this glorious set of Lewis and Clark. And of course, when he created these, he did not leave out one of the most important people to the Lewis and Clark expedition. And that was Sacagawea, or Sacagawea. I know there are different ways to say that name. And so he's got her here. Now if I open that up, she doesn't have as much gear. She was fairly minimalist. So you see over on this side, there's nothing. But on this side, there is Sacagawea, or Sacagawea. And she's got her little baby there, you see up here. In I can't remember what this was called, the carrier that they would put on their back or on their front and carry the baby. She's got her dagger and her little pouches, chalkboard, a little chalkboard thing. And, of course, her outfit, as you can see there. And also with this, he gave me, there's a little campfire he made that has a fan in it that blows up fake flames with light, orange light on them. And it's kind of cool. But I just had to show those off. That's Lewis and Clark. And so on this thing about Lewis and Clark, and by the way, folks, if you want to see that, you can come over anytime and see that over on archived at the YouTube channel if you're only listening audibly. That's the little part of geek in me. I collect Star Trek characters and Star Wars characters and all of that. I've got Spock is standing over there and Kirk is over there. And I used to have a lineup before I changed the office around, a lineup of all my Star Trek action figures and their ships and all that. But this, I had never seen somebody do this with history before. And so that's what made it very cool. And my kids would love to have opened that up. And one time I was tempted and I said, no, I want to keep these pristine. I mean, you say, what good is it if you can't play with it? Well, I didn't want them played with. I wanted to save these. And all those little parts would have been gone. It would have been gone forever if I had let this be opened up. So, anyway, Lewis and Clark. Their exploratory journey to under the mandate of Thomas Jefferson was to find the Pacific coast, and it was early in the 19th century. And the number of published accounts describing the opening of the American West is in the thousands. You just go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble. You just go start looking, or go to your local library and look at the opening of the American West. And look at the books you're going to find and the things written about it. And the greatest concentration of recorded experience and observation came out of the 30-year span between 1860 and 1890. We're talking just pre-Civil War, 1 year before the Civil War started, all the way up to 1890, really the gateway into the 20th century. And this period is covered, if you pick up D. Brown's book, the late D. Brown, by the way, Bury My Heart and Wounded Knee. This is a book he wrote that is talking about that era. And it was an incredible era of violence in America. We think the 1960s, the late 1960s, was full of violence and racial tension. Go back to 1860 to 90. And there was greed, there was audacity, there was sentimentality, there was undirected exuberance from the expansionists. There was this reverential attitude toward the ideas and the ideals of personal freedom for those who already had it. That's like the slavery issue. We find when we go back to our founding documents. I've got the Constitution rolled up and hanging behind the swords on my wall here. There were people groups living here in America that were not considered when those documents were written. The founders eventually had to admit, we have to consider these people. If we say all people are created equal, then what did they do? People set about trying to establish that blacks weren't human. They were subhuman. Same with the Native American cultures. So the people who already had freedom were trying to deny it to others. And during that time, the culture and civilization of the American Indian was destroyed. The late 1800s. And out of that time came virtually all of the great myths of the American West. The romance of the cowboys and Indians. You know, when I was growing up, it's like the Willie Nelson song, my heroes have always been cowboys. While Captain Kirk was my hero in Star Trek, I was like any other boy drawn to cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians. And the Indians were always the bad guys. It was the cowboy. You want to be the cowboy, the guy with the spurs that jingle, jingle, jingle. And I'm wearing my six-shooter that I named Rosie on my hip, and, my cowboy boots and my hat. And that's, we looked at that. I'm riding my horse and should have been a cowboy. Should have learned to rope and ride. So, you know the song. And so my view of the American West changed when I started to learn that there was another view of how the West was won. Another view of the expansion of America, of the United States into the American West. And that expansion was really the conquering of another people. And the near genocide in some cases, the disgraceful, tragic genocide of another people. So we could expand into those areas. And so during that time, the culture and the civilization of the American Indian was absolutely destroyed. It was wiped out. And the same time fostered all these great myths and these great romances about living in the West, the wild, wild West. And tales of fur traders, mountain men, steamboat pilots, gold seekers, gamblers, gunmen, cavalrymen, cowboys, harlots, missionaries, schoolmarms, and homesteaders, and ranchers. And only occasionally was the voice of the American Indian heard at that time. And then more often than not, it was recorded by the pen of a white guy. Now, I don't use that term today in politics. It's different. When I hear somebody say, and the Congress is just full of old white guys, I just want to slap them. I want to bitch slap them with the closest thing I can bitch slap them with. That's political. I'm talking about what was actually going on. You had the white expansion, the white European expansion, and the history was generally written down by those guys. And the Indian was the dark menace of the myth, the savage red man, you know. And even if he'd known how to write in English, where would he have found a printer or a publisher? It was a completely different kind of culture that we were infringing into to expand our interests into the West. And there's something you got to say. If you set all of that aside and look at it from the moment where we sit in history today, America is a great country. We have it from sea to shining sea, from the Gulf of Mexico on the south and Canada on the north. That's the United States. It's a glorious country. With its problems and with its setbacks and with its issues, we live in the most glorious country on earth, despite the atrocities we committed to make it so. But all these stories, the Native American stories, the Indian voices, they're not lost. They're not gone forever, these voices of the past. And a few authentic accounts of American Western history were recorded by Indians either in pictographs or in translated English, and some managed to get published in obscure journals and pamphlets of the day, books of small circulation. And in the late 19th century, when white Americans' curiosity about the Indian survivors of the wars reached this high point, enterprising newspaper reporters frequently interviewed warriors and chiefs and gave them an opportunity to express their opinions on what they felt happened in the West. Now, this is a lot like if you look at England, Great Britain, in 1700, Bonnie Prince Charlie led forces of the Highland Scots against England's, why is his name slipping me? It's because I didn't review my history before doing this. Coming off the top of my head, Cumberland. Lord Cumberland led troops to subjugate Bonnie Prince Charlie. 1746 was the year of the Battle of Culloden Moor. Up near Inverness, think Loch Ness, and you know where Inverness is, at the northeast tip of Loch Ness. And outside there in the moors, they had this battle. And, of course, the Scottish clans were utterly defeated at that battle by Lord Cumberland and the British forces. And forever, that ended the clan system of government. The clan system of life was eradicated. It was outlawed to wear the kilt and the tartan. It was outlawed to speak Gaelic. There was no more clan governance. It all became subterfuge behind the scenes. Until a few years later, the King of England decided, why waste all this manpower? And he opened up the British Army to Scottish regiments. And that's how they gave them some vestige of their clan governance back. And it wasn't until the Victorian era, we're talking the late 1800s, that the Scottish way of life became over-romanticized. And you started seeing more of the kilts and the tartans being worn by the great lords in England and so on. And so it's very similar to what happened to the Native American culture. Wiped out the clan system, the tribal system. And then it started to be romanticized as time went on. And the quality of the interviews that were granted to some of these survivors of the expansion into the American West, these Native American survivors, they varied greatly depending on the abilities of the interpreters or on the inclination of the Indians to want to speak freely about what they had experienced. Some feared these reprisals for telling the truth, and others were just very happy in hoaxing reporters with tall tales and shaggy dog stories about their experiences and what they had seen. And contemporary newspaper statements by Indians had to be read at the time with skepticism. And even when you do historical research now, you've got to be a little skeptical of what you find in those articles, those old articles. Although some of them are masterpieces of irony, others burn with outbursts of poetic fury. And so I could imagine being a part of a group of people who had been subjugated. What if we lost our country? What if America was invaded? And everybody who is a citizen of the United States today became outlaw. You were targeted for death. And after all the smoke cleared, if you were the remnant still alive, imagine as you grew older, 20, 30, 40 years later, you would be looked to by those people, the conquerors, as, the romantic remnant of American culture that once existed that we have wiped out. Imagine how you would be when you're telling your tales. How patriotic you might be. How fearful you might be of saying the wrong thing for fear that you'd be killed. How haphazard you'd be with your storytelling because you didn't care anymore. I'm old, this happened to me, and I'm going to tell you the way I saw it and the way it was. And I think this is what you got, a mixture of those things. And among the richest sources of all these first-person statements by Native Americans are the records of the treaty councils, where they'd sit together and have these treaty meetings, these councils, and other formal meetings with civilian military representatives of the United States government. There's a guy named Isaac Pittman, whose new stenographic system was coming into vogue during the second half of the 19th century. And when the Indians spoke in a council meeting, they had a recording clerk who sat beside the official interpreter. And even when the meetings were in these remote parts of the West, someone usually was available to write down the speeches. And because of the slowness of the translation process, much of what was said could be recorded in longhand. Now, imagine that. I read a book called The Pirate Hunter, and it was all about the infamous pirate Captain Kidd, who lived in the late 1600s and went to trial, even though he was working for the King of England at the time, and he was a privateer. He was still tried as a pirate, and he was executed. But you have transcripts that were written in longhand during that time of those trials, and I read through that stuff. And there were many times where they would say, "How do you plea?" And back then, you were guilty automatically by the state unless you were able to provide evidence that the state's accusation was wrong. That's really what founded our system of jurisprudence here in the United States, was that you're innocent until proven guilty. The state has to prove your guilt. And so I was reading through those transcripts, and they were in longhand. And it was very interesting because he'd be asked, "How do you plea?" And he says, "I will not plea." And they say, "We need you to place your plea. Otherwise, you're guilty." And he said, "I will not plea unless I get my papers." He said, "I need my confiscated papers to prove my innocence, to mount my legal defense." And this is all in writing. So it was very interesting when you see that stuff written down and you see the testimony of people. And so when these council meetings took place between the U.S. government and Native American leaders, the interpreters quite often were half-bloods who know how to speak the languages but seldom could read or write. So like most oral peoples, like the Native American culture, their history was oral tradition. They depended upon imagery to express their thoughts. And so the English translations were filled with graphic similes, metaphors of the natural world. If an eloquent Indian had a poor interpreter, his words could be transformed to flat prose. But a good interpreter could make a poor speaker sound absolutely poetic. And so when you start looking into some of these documents, if you make that a point of interest, you'll find some very interesting stuff that gets said. But it's kind of all over the map. And most of the leaders of the American Native American culture, most of the leaders in these treaties, they spoke very freely and candidly in councils with white officials. as they became more sophisticated in the matters during the 1870s and the 1880s. And they demanded the right to choose their own interpreters and their own recorders, which were not electronic devices, obviously. They were people writing. And in this later period, all the members of the tribe were free to speak. And some of the older men of these tribes, they chose such opportunities to recount events they had witnessed in the past. Excuse me. Or to sum up, I have a cough button, but it's tedious to get to it. So pardon me every now and then. Consider it, we're just having a conversation. And so they brought up all their old stories, and they found a great opportunity to talk about them or to sum up the histories of their peoples. And while the Indians lived through this doom period of their civilization, they vanished from the earth, and millions of their words are preserved in official records. Many of the more important council proceedings were published in government documents and reports. The very cool thing, I think, about all of that, those recordings, is that you can go look those up. You can go find those documents. You can find books that have published them. I'll try to get a list for you on that. And read the accounts of these men and these women. And out of all these sources of almost forgotten oral history, there is a narrative of the conquest that has been put together through oral tradition, through writing, through researching these documents. And this is what D. Brown did in his book, Bury My Hearted Wounded Knee. And there is a narrative of the conquest of the American West as the victims of that conquest experienced it. You'll find that in this book. There is a side to the westward expansion that we'd become a little more aware of in American culture, but there's a side to all of this that is not the glorious expansion of the United States into the American West to meet the Pacific coast. Because you had basically, if you're looking at a map, looking at me, you have the East Coast all the way up to the Mississippi. You have the Pacific coast, California up to Oregon, Washington State. But the Rocky Mountains and the Plains states, that swath right down the middle from north to south, was all considered Indian territory. And this is what we expanded into. There's a clear understanding now, I think, because of men like D. Brown, who recorded this all down and did the research, and because of some of these records that still exist, that we gain a clearer understanding of what the American Indian is by knowing who he was and what he was. If you have fear of something, I've always said, and I've heard it said many times, I learned this from somewhere, understanding something eradicates fear. I wrote about that in my own book, Tam O'Hare. So to understand something, Horatio McNutt said to Tam O'Hare, so to understand a thing means that you'll have no more fear of it? And Tam answers, not always. He says, but to have an understanding of something gives you a better perspective on how to process your fear. And find out if you even need to have fear in existence. So, the words, the Native Americans, their own words that were transcribed, that were written down, whenever possible, give us that history and give us that understanding. And Americans who've always looked westward when reading about this period should read this book of D. Brown's and talk about all of these things facing eastward. Don't look at the westward expansion. Look at the position from looking eastward to what was coming at you. And that's a good way to read any history of Native American culture, to read Dee Brown's book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, to attempt to process what really happened there, as opposed to what the history books told us. It's like, and we may talk about this one of these days, the whole Little Bighorn, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, General George Armstrong Custer. We all have this very romanticized view of what happened there. How Custer and all of his soldiers, he had only about 200 soldiers total, how they all died, pretty much to a man. They were overwhelmed by an overwhelming Native American force. And there were two endings that happened at the Little Bighorn, which, by the way, we talk about Custer's last stand on the little hill at the Little Bighorn. That was our name for it. The Native American name for the area was the Greasy Grass, off what we called the Little Bighorn River. And here is Custer and his men. They killed their horses to use as barricades, and they fought until they were all killed. And the Native Americans won that day. They were very confident after that battle. But that confidence soon dwindled, because it may have been the end of Custer and his attacks and the cavalry up to that point. And the Native American warriors thought they brought something to an end. There was the beginning of the end of westward expansion. But at the same time, it was the beginning of the end for the Native American culture. Because while they won a great victory, the United States was more invigorated to put them down. And so it's been romanticized from both sides. They say when they found, if you go to the Custer battlefield, now I've only lived this through pictures and documentaries. We were going to try to get out there with the family this year, do a camping trip, but school started too quick. We just ran out of time this summer and didn't get out there. But I want to visit that place. I want to visit Wounded Knee. There's a reason Dee Brown entitled his book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. That was something that was said by Crazy Horse, who was never photographed, so we don't know what he looked like. But he was a great warrior. He was a great warrior at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. So he said, bury my heart at Wounded Knee when he dies. Wounded Knee is a place, and you can go visit that place. There was a big standoff, if you remember, in the early 70s. If you weren't alive during the time, I heard about it when it was happening. I was a young teenager with the AIM, the American Indian Movement, that was holed up in the schoolhouse at Wounded Knee, making demands. And that is the same place where you can go visit a monument today, because in 1890, while the Native Americans were gathered doing the Ghost Dance, which is the song I used at the beginning of my show opener for a couple of weeks, they were all gunned down. And there's a whole story behind that as well. That was really the last of the big massacres. But this topic is not a cheerful topic. But history has this way of intruding itself upon the present. And perhaps if we recount it and talk about it, we'll have a clearer understanding of the American Indian and what they experienced. And you might be surprised, really, to learn the words of gentle reasonableness that came out of the mouths of the Indians who were stereotyped in the American myth as ruthless savages. Learning about their relationship to the earth. Some people try to downplay that. It shouldn't be downplayed. That's what they were. That's who they were. That was their culture. The American Indian knew that life was equated with the earth and its resources, that America was a paradise. And they couldn't comprehend why the intruders from the East were so determined to destroy them and wipe them out. And everything that they had, as well as America itself. And if you never have the chance to see the poverty, the hopelessness, the squalor of modern reservation life, you might find it possible to understand the reasons why. And I think some of that's changed, as I've said, over recent years, but that's still there. Take some time to learn something about this history. I'm going to talk more about this in next week. We'll hit this. I want to get some guests to talk about this as well. But we're at the end of the show tonight, folks. I hope that this was meaningful. Something different. It's Friday. My head's not very clear today. And now I'm going to put it to rest. So, thanks for being here. Well, see you next time. Have a great weekend. I cannot say I will not at some point jump into YouTube over the weekend and do something, maybe with the rainy. So if you're around, you might catch us. But we'll see you right back here after a weekend break, Monday. And you hang tight, sit tight, don't go anywhere. We'll be back in a couple of days.